Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Fox with the Fox Alliance. Welcome to our second quarter economic outlook. Our goal is to offer insights into big economic themes. Our topic for today is the Russian invasion. Is there cause for worry? If you're thinking this seems early for the second quarter update, you would be right. We felt that it would be important to have this discussion today in light of what's going on around the world. Before we get started, I want to say that what is happening in Ukraine is tragic, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the people of Ukraine. Today, we'll be discussing the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Why isn't Ukraine in NATO? We'll talk about the sanctions against Russia, what's likely to happen next, and then we'll finish up with stock markets and global implications. Our panelists will be speaking for 30 minutes, and we'll leave 15 minutes for questions at the end. Based on our compliance rules, we can't take questions from the chat feature. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, please email me at the email address on the screen. That's bill@thefoxalliance.com. Our presenters today will be Max Clark and Laura Cooper. Both are wealth advisors with the Fox Alliance. Our third presenter will be Josh Renfro. He's one of our managing partners. Max will be our first speaker. Max, if you could take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. You know, as we get started here, I think it's important for us to really understand how have we gotten to the point that we are today with Putin invading Ukraine. And I think the best place for us to start is to look all the way back to when the USSR came into being. That was in December of 1922. I'm sure many of you guys recognize Vladimir Lenin here on the screen, but the USSR really came about out of the Bolshevik Revolution back in the early 1900s. And this is formerly known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it was a really kind of an agreement or a joining, a unification of four socialist or Soviet republics. And those were the republics of Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and the Transcaucasian Federation. You know, for most of its history, the USSR was a very centralized one-party system, primarily controlled from its seat of power there in Moscow by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And obviously, as you can see from the map here, Russia was its largest and most populous member of the USSR, and therefore really kind of became one of its leaders. But following World War II, the USSR really emerged as one of the Allied victors and found themselves in control of a large swath of Eastern Europe. And that the USSR and its satellite states there in Eastern Europe really kind of became known as the Eastern Bloc. And they made some confrontations against the Western Bloc, largely led by the United States. And of course, that's when the Cold War began. This was really the impetus for the formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was founded in April of 1949, and it's an intergovernmental military alliance, originally between 12 countries. Two of those, United States and Canada in North America, and 10 there in Europe. It constitutes a collective security force, effectively, whereby its independent member states agree to mutually defend one another should there be an attack by any external party. Obviously, at the time, this was in reference to the Eastern Bloc. Well, the Cold War continued over the course of many, many years from the mid-1940s, late 1940s, till the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it culminated in the fall of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Eastern and Western Germany. As the largest country within the USSR, Russia really came out of that, came out of the fall of the Soviet Union as the continuation of the USSR on the global stage. They really took the place of the USSR on the global stage. And at that point, many would say, and I think Putin would say this, well, there's no further need for NATO. Well, what has happened since that time? Look on the left-hand side of this picture, you'll see 1990. NATO is represented by the red countries, and obviously two are missing, which would be the United States and Canada, which are across the Atlantic. But then you take a look 20 years later, sorry, almost 30 years later, and you can see what has gradually happened with NATO. NATO has expanded. You'll see on the left-hand side the blue countries. Those represent countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, which was dissolved there in the early 1990s. And it was a pact between the Soviet Union and a lot of these Eastern European countries representing the Eastern Bloc. When that fell and dissolved, we can see that since that time, NATO has gradually been expanding and pretty significantly towards the east and towards Russia. And you can see on the right-hand side, Ukraine and a few others are a few of the countries asking for membership. They're one of the few left there in Europe looking to join NATO. And really, we've seen an expansion from the original 12 to about 30 countries currently. As you can imagine, Russia has been consistently opposed to this expansion. They've really viewed it as a reneging on the deal that was made to dissolve the USSR. Putin believes that an expansion to the east of the US of NATO was promised that would not occur, and he views that this is kind of the West reneging on their promise to not expand further. And they also really view it as a continuation of the Cold War and just really kind of an attempt to surround and isolate Russia. And this has really been a key emphasis of Putin's message over the past several years. In February of 2007, he asked, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this NATO expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? So you can see that this has been a clear message from Vladimir Putin for the last 20 years. This expansion eastward of NATO has been a big issue for him. Well, shortly after this speech, he began the Russo-Georgian War, which was really kind of Vladimir Putin's first challenge against NATO expansion. And as any good authoritarian thug would do, he referred to this invasion as a peace enforcement operation. Sure, of course it was. Well, that war lasted about 5 days, and Russia ultimately kept control of the separatist regions and kind of the contested regions of Georgia. But the key thing to note here is that Russian international relations were largely unaffected. The West really did not respond much at all to what was happening there in Georgia. Well, let's shift gears just a little bit, jump forward a few years, and talk about some of Ukraine's history. You guys may remember the name Viktor Yanukovych. He was elected president in 2010. And there was a very key kind of shift in Ukraine that occurred during his election or during his tenure as president. In November of 2013, he rejected the Ukrainian-European Association Agreement, which would have had Ukraine pursuing closer ties with the EU and with NATO. He rejected that and began pursuing closer ties with Russia. Well, this caused significant protests across Ukraine. This was dubbed the Euro Maiden. And Yanukovych attempted to really violently put those down. Many civilians were killed. And that sparked the Revolution of Dignity, which the protesters then drove Yanukovych from office. And he now remains in exile in Russia today. Well, in response to everything that occurred there, Russia invaded Crimea, which we all remember from back in 2014, and they subsequently annexed that territory. 1.5 million people fled Ukraine, over 9,000 people have been killed, and Russia did experience some minor responses from the international community. They were expelled from the G8, and the European Union and the United States imposed some sanctions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that gives you kind of an idea of the conflict that we've seen there in Ukraine so far. Step forward a few years after he's been ousted from the country. And in February of 2019, Ukraine really cemented their determination to move into the European Union and join both the EU and NATO. They actually amended their constitution to pursue membership in both of those entities. Well, one of the questions that I think a lot of people ask is, well, why isn't Ukraine in NATO? They actually started this process back in 2008. They asked to join NATO, and NATO welcomed that bid, and they really developed a path for them to meet certain criteria. But when you take a look at NATO's requirements, there are certain, quote, political, economic, and military goals. And the official reason that Ukraine isn't in NATO at this point is because it hasn't met the criteria like addressing political corruption and developing its democracy. Just think back to Yanukovych and the ousting of a president. That's not a fully functioning democracy. And I'm sure NATO looks at that and says, well, you aren't meeting the criteria. That being said, even if they had met those criteria, I think there are certain unwritten reasons that many European leaders have concerns about Ukraine joining NATO, specifically that they think that would really negatively impact the relationship with Russia. And I think that's proven to be true up until this point. So let's step back into the history of Ukraine here. This is a face that we've all come to know over the past several weeks, which is Volodymyr Zelensky. He is the current president of Ukraine, elected in 2019. And one of his central campaign promises was to end the war in the Donbass. The Donbass is the eastern contested regions of Ukraine, in addition to Crimea. And he really attempted to achieve an end to that war through diplomacy with Putin. Well, I think it's safe to say that those negotiations have failed and have been unsuccessful. And in 2021, Zelensky made public requests for membership in NATO. That really did not make Vladimir Putin very pleased. And even prior to that, in April of 2021, he began amassing troops at the border with Ukraine. He said, that his real concern is that if Ukraine joins NATO, there's really a threat or a security issue for Russia, because we could see NATO bringing in long-range missiles, and it could really be a big problem for Putin. There may be other reasons for that, but ultimately this is when it all began. In April of 2021, he began amassing troops on the border. And if you take a look at something he wrote in 2021, he stated that he really believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He said, quote, "I'm confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia." This really speaks to the fact that I don't think he's really just protecting against the expansion of NATO. He really has a passion and a desire to restore the glory of Russia, restore the glory of the Soviet Union. If you guys remember, he was a former KGB officer. So he has a love for the USSR. And it's really something that we kind of think is also a part of what he's looking to accomplish here. Well, in February of 2024, following comments from Joe Biden that he would not send troops into Ukraine, and following, if you just think back to all of the times that the international community has really not responded to his attempts to expand, made the decision to invade in February of this year. Again, the reasoning for this really appears to be that he is defending himself against the expansion of the West towards him. But we really believe that there's also an aspect of Putin wanting to restore the glory of Russia and expand and reclaim, quote, the territory of the empire. Now, it appears that he's made a rather, he's bet on the international community not responding and Ukraine not defending, something that has played out not to be true. And to talk about the international response to this, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who will talk about the current sanctions and everything that's going on that front.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Max. So as we know, Russia has invaded Ukraine, as Max just mentioned. And pre the invasion, there are about 2,200 sanctions on Russia from the international community coming out of 2014 and their invasion of Crimea. And some of those, the biggest sanctions that we've seen were the United States banning transactions for two major energy firms and banks, and Canada having sanctions against Russian arms, energy, and financial entities. And that was a pretty big deal coming out of the Crimean War, but not enough to really have a huge impact on the Russian economy. Well, post the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, we've seen about 5,500 sanctions from the international community against Russia, and not just from the United States and Canada, European Union, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan. And as Max mentioned, there's been a lot of talk about will the US intervene with troops or not. And it's been pretty apparent up until this point that unless this conflict spills out into NATO territories, that we will not see troops on the ground in Ukraine against Russia. So the biggest question is, how do you hit Russia where it hurts? And in that case, we look at the economic breakdown. A lot of geopolitical analysts view Russia as an oversized gas station. And if you want to really hurt them from an economic perspective, hitting them in their oil and gas industry is really the target for a lot of these sanctions. Now, looking at Russia's breakdown of their economy, almost all of their exports are natural resources. And we've heard a lot about oil and natural gas here in the last few months. But even industrial metals like iron, aluminum, copper, nickel, precious metals, gold and platinum, and wheat and other agricultural products are a majority part of Russia's economy. So yes, you can target energy, you can target banking, but you could also target some of these other natural resources spaces. Now, that's all great and dandy, especially here in the United States, where we have banned the import of Russian oil and gas. Only about 7 to 8% of our oil comes from Russia, though, in the first place. So yes, we do see that a little bit at the pumps as far as increase in prices, but there's never a concern for shortages or a lack of oil and natural gas. In Europe, that's a little bit of a different story. 85% of Russian oil goes to Europe and China. 85%. So when you talk about the dependence of Europe on Russian energy, it is incredibly, incredibly high. And specifically looking at Europe, this chart shows European dependence on Russian energy. And the darker red the country is here, then the more dependent it is on Russian energy. So countries like Finland and Latvia, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, and Croatia are in a position to where they can provide sanctions on certain areas, but they really cannot afford to sanction the energy that keeps them going. So it's a big question mark is how effective are these sanctions really going to be? If you can't hit Russia, or the majority of Europe cannot hit Russia truly as far as sanctions in the energy perspective because of their dependence and need for that product, then where do they go? And this kind of leads us to the question of what is the line? And as Max mentioned, as far as right now, there's been no talk of sending US troops into Ukraine to help defend against the Russian invasion. On multiple occasions, when asked, President Biden said, there's not, that's a world war when Americans and Russians start shooting at one another. And we've heard this from multiple political analysts, from the president himself, that unless we see spillover into a NATO territory, that we are not expected to see any sort of intervention from the United States from a physical troop perspective. Now, we have seen the Russian military get very close to the Polish border and targeting a military base in Lviv, about 10 miles from the Polish border. So could this spill out into a NATO territory, either intentionally or unintentionally? That's a very real possibility. But as it stands right now, sanctions, sending weapons, and trying to help from an intelligence perspective as much as we can is the line for the United States in their intervention. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh to talk about what happens next.
Thanks, Laura. So that's literally what we're going to talk about. What happens next? So we think that when it comes to the immediate future, there are really two possibilities. The first of which is that we see Russia completely take over Ukraine. They topple the government. They either set up a puppet government or simply annex Ukraine to become part of Russia. At this point, we think that's probably the most likely option. Russia doesn't really have a reason to stop short. The only reason that they would, which leads us kind of to the second immediate alternative option, is that there's some negotiation where Russia gets to keep most of eastern Ukraine or even most of Ukraine entirely. A small portion of Ukraine gets to remain its own country, but only in exchange for the West withdrawing a large portion of its sanctions, which the real question is, will they have a willingness to do that, short of Russia completely withdrawing from Ukraine, which we don't see as likely. So in our opinion, the first option is probably the most likely at this point. Beyond the immediate side of things, there's then another area, which, as we've already discussed, we do not believe that Russia intends to attack an actual NATO country. Russia knows that there is a line in the sand where the US will respond with brute military force if it crosses. And we believe that line is actual attacking of a NATO country. However, there are other non-NATO countries in Europe as well as outside of Europe that could be potential targets as well, or could have been potential additional targets. Countries like Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus. Belarus will most likely not be a target because Belarus is already a puppet state of Russia today. In fact, a large chunk of the military force that actually invaded Ukraine came out of Belarus. So Belarus is not one of those countries. Within Asia, we've got a few additional ones. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan were all part of the former Soviet USSR and don't have a lot of strategic alliances that would protect them in the event that Russia decided to also send military force in a significant way. So that's what we view on the more immediate front as being likely to happen. Now, beyond that, though, the real question is this: what are the biggest risks? And there are a lot of them. Whenever you involve a significant military move, there's all kinds of, there's primary risks, and then there's secondary and tertiary risks that also pose significant problems if they actually become an eventuality. So the first one I wanted to touch on is that the Ukrainian pipeline. There is a very large pipeline that runs from Russia through Ukraine and supplies the vast majority of the oil and natural gas that Europe consumes from Russia. It is so profitable that Ukraine alone, just by having the pipeline pass through their country, receives over $2 billion of royalties from Russia in exchange for allowing that pipeline to pass through their country. So obviously Russia has an extended interest in not damaging or destroying this pipeline because it is also their bread and butter. It is a tremendous source of wealth and power to them. But in war, accidents happen, either from the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. And the other question you have to ask is, at the point that Ukraine is inevitably going to fall out of desperation, do Ukrainian rebel forces ultimately hurt this pipeline? It's a real possibility. Beyond that, and this is honestly one of the bigger risks, with the sanctions, there's a lot of US oil and gas companies that have operations overseas in other countries. They operate and actually produce a lot of the oil and natural gas around the world in other countries. With some of their improved efficiencies and things like that, it makes sense for a lot of countries to actually import that expertise as opposed to doing it themselves. And that's the case to at least some degree in Russia. There are certain US companies that are operating in Russian-held oil and gas fields that with the sanctions will no longer be able to operate there. And so the question then also is, how much will that impact the oil supply? Will Russian-owned companies be able to come in quickly and be able to maintain the supply that is being produced? That's one of the biggest questions that at this point is a really big unknown. And that could really impact what oil and gas prices do in the future. Another big one is the global hunger crisis. Russia and Ukraine are considered the breadbasket of Europe, producing 30% of the wheat around the world. And so a lot of countries in that region are very dependent upon it. Egypt is a very classic example, and there's a lot of other countries in Africa and the Middle East that are heavily dependent on Ukrainian and Russian grain to survive. As you can imagine, farmers aren't out in the fields a whole lot when their fields are getting bombarded. And so the question is, how long does this war last, and how much will that impact the Ukrainian harvest this year. How much Ukrainian wheat will ultimately be destroyed or not be able to be produced just due to how long this war lasts, / how much of their fields get destroyed. And so that's another huge factor that is also unknown. That's one of the things I want you guys to get a sense of is there are a lot of risks with what's happening right now, but a lot of those risks they're not certain risks where they're absolutely going to happen. They're things that potentially could happen depending on the exact outcome of events there. So that's another huge one. And along with global hunger, like Egypt, once again, as an example, these are countries that just struggle to fulfill their citizens' basic necessities. Egypt specifically subsidizes their grain purchases, so it's cheaper for their citizens to buy grain. With wheat already going up in price significantly, that's going to make subsidizing it much more expensive. And so the question is, can they afford to do that? And if they can't afford to do that, will the increasing cost that they have to pass on to their citizens ultimately result in things like civil unrest, like we saw in the Arab Spring several years back? Beyond that, another major side effect that a lot of people aren't thinking about is, does Russia become subservient to China? And a lot of people are like, well, how would that happen? Well, as Laura mentioned earlier, there are only two ways to really hit Russia hard. The first of which is by stopping the purchase of natural gas and oil. And with their biggest, potential client being Europe, the question is Europe going to do it? And so far, the answer is no, Europe cannot. In fact, there was a quote earlier from the German prime minister saying that Europe simply doesn't have a choice. For them to continue to function, they have to continue to purchase Russian oil and natural gas. Now, they made a very poetic gesture by saying they're going to reduce their exposure to Russian and oil and natural gas by 2030. That doesn't help things right now. And so they aren't going to realistically hurt Russia in that way. And the one other big way they could really do it is if they were to completely cut Russia off from SWIFT, the payment system that allows most of global transactions to take place. And while a partial cutoff of SWIFT has taken place, Europe can't afford for a full cutoff to take place because they wouldn't be able to pay for the natural gas and oil that they need. So Russia has been only partially cut off. But what it has revealed to Russia is that they can't be fully reliant on a US-European system, because at any point in time, if the US and Europe are able to completely make themselves independent of Russian oil and natural gas, they could do a complete cutoff and Russia would be in a huge mess. So Russia has already started to integrate their payment systems with China. And up to this point, the relationship between China and Russia has been an alliance of equals in which neither country can really force the other to do something. It's all about persuasion. But in a situation where after this, who knows, maybe Russia begins to make a move towards integrating more fully with China and developing and modernizing, and China ultimately modernizes their own system to be an alternative to the US system. And if that happens, now Russia and China are not an alliance of equals. They're an alliance where one is subservient, and that would be, in this case, Russia. So that's another thing a lot of people aren't thinking about. Another huge one is the US dollar's reserve currency status. Russia, like many foreign countries, transacts a lot of their business in dollars, including their bonds. And so when this whole situation erupted and sanctions were invoked, one of the biggest areas that has been a hit to them is their reserves in both US dollars as well as gold, to a large extent, have been frozen. So Russia had a lot of money in US dollars, about $500 billion, just shy of $500 billion in US currency. And most of that they can't access because the US has frozen it. And so one of the things that countries that are not friendly to the US or even enemies of the US are looking at as they're watching this, specifically China, is how helpful are US currency reserves? During good times, yes, it's helpful for transacting business. But in the event that we come in conflict with the US has a lot of power to be able to freeze a lot of US held assets. And so for a country like China that holds over $3.2 trillion of currency reserves, much of which is US dollars, they've got to be asking themselves the question, if we ever want to take Taiwan or do anything else that the US doesn't like, we've got to become sanction proof. And one of the things that is not going to help them be sanction proof is holding a lot of US dollars that ultimately the US can simply say, we're freezing. So that's one other unintended consequence that the US probably hasn't, or at least is being forced to deal with in this situation. One of the biggest risks is that the conflict broadens. As Laura mentioned, this could happen intentionally or unintentionally. The worst case scenario would be a NATO country gets attacked, because at that point, we probably are looking at a World War III kind of situation. We don't believe that this outcome is likely. Russia understands that there is a line, and if he crosses it, he will be met with brute military force. And in this situation, a lot of political strategists believe that what we've seen here is a situation in which Putin has overestimated his own strength and underestimated the retaliation that would be ensued by this conflict. And so it's been harder to conquer Ukraine than he originally anticipated. So even if he had intentions to attack other countries, how hard this current invasion has got to give him some pause with those plans. And if he wasn't intending to do so before, the difficulty he's experiencing now is only reinforcing that. One of the other potential outcomes that a lot of people talked about is, could China take advantage of the confusion right now and invade Taiwan? We do believe that the chances of that are fairly unlikely. And there's a couple of reasons for that. China and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine are two very different situations. First, we actually have a small US troop presence in Taiwan. So that's the first thing. Leading up to this situation, Biden said the only way that we get involved in Ukraine is if there's the death of a lot of US citizens. And so we don't think it was an accident that Russia took weeks mustering troops on the border, because it gave time ultimately for Biden to withdraw the US embassy, as well as any military force, which is only embassy troops at that point. That's not the case in Taiwan. We have military troops there. An invasion by sea would have to take place, and the US Navy has a strong presence in those waters. On top of that, the United States has a long-standing relationship and alliance with Taiwan, with us promising to protect Taiwan in the event that China ultimately tries to invade. And President Biden has ultimately reinforced that promise on several occasions. So we don't think that that's likely to be significant. And of course, that leads us to the final piece, which is, how does this ultimately impact the stock market and also just global economic implications? So the first of which is, we believe volatility is likely to persist for a considerable length of time, for at least the length of the conclusion of military conflict, either through Russia completely taking over Ukraine or through some kind of negotiated peace, whichever ultimately ends up happening. While Ukraine's economy is relatively insignificant, it is one of the weakest economies in Europe. It has the lowest GDP per capita of any country in Europe. It does have two significant economic components that Laura mentioned: wheat, and then also some industrial metals, nickel being one of the most notable. So those areas will have some impact. But if the entire, outside of the secondary effects that happen, if the entire Ukrainian economy was just wiped out, it would be a relatively small portion of the global economy. Russia, on the other hand, is a different scenario. It's the 9th largest economy in the world. But as Laura mentioned, they're a glorified gas station, as most geopolitical strategists will tell you. And so a lot of the real question, and we talked about this earlier, is how well has Vladimir Putin and his allies prepared for this event? Did they expect that they would have to reorient a lot of their trade from countries like, as an example, the US, and move it to a country like China? China can easily afford to purchase Russian oil. If they consumed all of Russia's oil, it would still only meet 17% of the demand that China has as a country. So there's a lot of room there for Russia to ultimately consume a lot more oil. For China to consume a lot more Russian oil. The real question, though, is how long does it take to transition that? The US is saying we're not going to purchase Russian oil. If Russia can simply turn around and look to sell that to China, then yes, it will hurt because there will be that transition period. But the real question comes down to how long will that transition period be? If it's on the shorter end of things, it's a relatively symbolic gesture. If it's something that takes months or even a year to renegotiate and work through, then that becomes something that legitimately hurts Russia in a significant way. And it also will hurt the rest of the global economy, because Russia today is one of the largest suppliers of oil. Between 9 and 11 million barrels of oil are produced by them. And so if a decent portion of their production cannot be sold, that is going to result in a significant supply and demand imbalance, which will likely result in oil prices remaining quite high. On the flip side, though, if Russia can simply reshuffle the deck and instead of selling to the US, they sell to China and some other countries, then that situation changes and the supply simply is shifted. And if that happens, energy prices may not stay as high as long, which leads us to the third point. We do believe energy prices will remain elevated for some time. And the biggest factor to how long will come down to how quickly the global supply chain can be realigned. One thing that is important to recognize here is that OPEC Plus, which includes Russia, was planning on raising the monthly supply of oil produced by just their block by 200,000 barrels a month. So we have a natural increasing supply, but at the end of the day, if Russia's not able to sell 2 or 3 million or 4 million barrels of its oil anymore, then that becomes problematic because that 200,000 barrels is a drop in the bucket. And then of course, one of the other factors is how much supply can actually be turned on. How quickly can old wells that were originally not being drilled and developed and actually executed on at $40, $50 an oil, which now is profitable at 100 plus, how many of those will ultimately come online? And that's just something it's impossible to know at this point in time. So we do view that oil and gas prices will remain elevated for some time, but once again, we believe the supply side question is the biggest thing that will contribute to whether that stays elevated or starts to come down. We do think that sanctions are unlikely to derail the global economy, with one exception, which is if oil and gas prices remain elevated for a substantial period of time, that it takes longer to reestablish those supply chains in a significant way. And the one other disclaimer we would add is if the global food crisis begins to lead to revolt and civil unrest in some emerging market countries and their economies are affected in kind of a secondary wave situation. If those two things happen, we could see the global economies take a decent hit and it could even result in a global recession. But if those two things are contained and it doesn't spread beyond that, we think it's likely that while global economies are weakened because of the war, that we're still likely in positive territory for the year, and especially the US being more far removed from that. Corporate profits here in the US were up 50% in 2021. And some of the major financial companies that we follow believe that the corporate profits are expected to grow 10 to 15% this year. Now, we do expect those numbers to drop some. You know, when you have oil and gas go up as much as they have, that's going to eat into the profit margins of some companies in a pretty significant way. With oil and gas prices where they are today, if it stayed for a whole year, it would be the equivalent of a $200 billion tax levied against both US companies as well as individuals and the economy as a whole. So obviously that can be very significant in ultimately keeping the economy down in a significant way. But big picture, there's a lot of risks. And so there's still a lot of questions surrounding exactly how everything will work out. But provided those two particular situations don't transpire, we think that it's likely that this year should still be a relatively good year, although not as good of a year as it would have been before the war ultimately broke out. And actually one last quick thing, not related to Russia, that I did want to mention that we also need to think about just from the inflation standpoint. We did our webinar last time on inflation. Right now, China has not had the Omicron variant in the way that the US has, but they've started to see it. And they've locked down about 50 million people in their country. They still have a very kind of zero COVID tolerance policy. And so that could be an area that could result in higher inflation this year. We think that we'll already see probably 1 or 2 percentage points of higher inflation this year due to the oil and gas prices being as high as they are. But if China goes into a major lockdown situation, that could really cut into the supply chain issues even more. And that could also continue to contribute to higher inflation this year. So kind of off point, but a big development that we're watching very closely. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bill for our questions.
Okay, we've got several questions. The first one is a little lengthy. After the Crimea outcry and sanctions 8 years ago, Russia started to develop a standalone system of fund transfers and interbank messaging that bypassed US and Western Europe banks and rules. It was at the time it was called MIR system, and essentially looked like it would be an alternative to the Visa, MasterCard, and other credit cards. Is MIR system, however it is named now, still in operation? And if so, what have the analysts said or speculated about whether the system could be retooled in short order to skirt SWIFT and therefore provide a cross-border payments network excluding the US and Western Europe. Josh, would you take care of that one?
Yeah, so it's changed names a couple times since then, but Russia does have a system like that. It has not had a lot of love and attention since the Crimea situation. So it's been developed some, but it's not fully developed out, and it would still be heavily reliant on the Chinese system. And the Chinese system isn't even where it needs to be. So it's an okay situation. So as an example, it can only handle transactions during normal business hours right now. So that's a pretty, extreme limiting factor for people who like to buy things in the evening and other things like that. So there are some significant limitations right now that would have to be worked out. And while that might be able to be worked out over months or even a year or two, it's not something that's going to be turned on immediately. So they have alternatives. They're not great alternatives.
Thank you, Josh. Next question. At the current stage of attack, it seems that Russia is either accidentally or intentionally taking aim at the Ukrainian nuclear power grid. What new issues, specifically finance or economic, have been discussed as arising because of the treatment of nuclear power plants in Ukraine? Max, if you take care of that one.
Sure. I think some things have developed since then, and that we've seen Russia, they've kind of ultimately become taking control of that nuclear power plant that was a real concern there. And it doesn't appear that they've done anything with it that would suggest their intentions to damage it or destroy it. So we really think that's a relatively low risk. Two things we'll say on that. One, it appears that Russia wants to preserve that power plant for their own use or for the use of Ukraine going forward. And then secondly, there are lots of protections in place to prevent another Chernobyl type of situation previously. So obviously with bombs going off around a nuclear power plant, it can be pretty concerning. We really don't anticipate that becoming much of an issue going forward, and think the risks are relatively low for that potential problem going forward.
Thank you, Max. Next question. Do you see any possibility that Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons? Who would like to take that one?
I can take that one. So as long as the conflict is limited to Ukraine, it's highly unlikely, because while it's taking Russia longer to actually take over Ukraine, it's still a fight of a David versus a Goliath situation. But in this situation, David doesn't have his, sling and stones. So it's one of those situations where Ukraine, while it may delay the inevitable will ultimately come. Russia will either take it over or they'll make some kind of negotiation. And so with that, there's no reason to use nuclear weapons in the midst of this unless the conflict broadens. So that's where we would see the larger risk is in the conflict broadening in a situation. Things accidentally spill over into a NATO country, sparking war with the West. Even in that situation, though, everybody knows the point that you start to use nuclear weapons, everybody else on the other side is also going to use it. So it's one of those situations where nobody wants to be the person who pulls that trigger first. The situation has to get very desperate in order for something like that to happen. And we would view that the situation we're in right now is very, very, very far from that point in time.
Okay. Last question. What seems to be the main non-governmental organization entities in the US who can responsibly and quickly manage either needed goods or funds into the resistance or stability efforts in non-Russian controlled Ukraine, and what contribution pipelines existing in the states for contributions or funds or items? Josh?
Yeah, so the Fox Alliance at this point, we have not been able to do extensive research into identifying non-governmental organizations to donate to if you want to help with the humanitarian crisis or the military efforts. The one thing we would say, though, is we would highly encourage, if you're considering giving in any significant way, just be aware that scam artists use situations like this all the time to make a quick dollar. And even things beyond that. A lot of times money can be donated and it never gets to the intended groups. So just make sure that if you are intending to give money to non-governmental organizations to help with the Ukrainian situation, make sure they're with well-established, vetted groups that have long history of helping in those areas, where your dollar actually is likely to get to the people that you really want to help. That's one of the biggest challenges with charitable and philanthropic giving in times like this.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Max, Laura, and Josh for your insight today. We look forward to seeing you all next quarter. And thanks for listening today. Have a good rest of the week.